السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل معظم الحكام ولا سيما في الغرب يقسمون العالم إلى ضحايا جديرين بالتعاطف معهم وآخرين غير مستحقين لذلك. أولئك المسموح لنا بإغداق الشفقة عليهم مثل الأوكرانيين الذين يعانون من تبعات الحرب الحديثة بحسب الخبراء، وأولئك الذين تم التقليل من قيمة وفداحة معاناتهم أو تجاهلها أو تم حتى نبذهم. إن الإرهاب الذي يمارسه الغرب وحلفاؤه ضد المدنيين العراقيين والفلسطينيين والسوريين والليبيين والصوماليين واليمنيين بات جزءاً من التكلفة المؤسفة للحرب. نعلم جميعاً أن التغطية الإعلامية الغربية لأوكرانيا مشحونة للغاية، حيث تلعب على المشاعر الغربية بالتعاطف مع بعض الضحايا المستضعفين وتوجيه المشاعر نحو الغضب الأخلاقي الذي يصر بل ويطالب على الانتقام وعقاب من يؤطرهم ويصفهم بالجنات. لعل أوروبا أعادت إقامة الستارة الحديدية، لكن هذه المرة ضد روسيا من خلال توظيف حرب نفسية بكل تكتيكاتها وسردية إعلامية قائمة على التلاعب بمن تصنفهم أعداء. يصبح الرئيس بوتين هو النقيض اللا إنساني البارد للنظام الليبرالي العقلاني، ما يستلزم شن حملة أخلاقية وربما عسكرية لمواجهة مثل هذه الوحشية كما يصنفها الإعلام الغربي. كل هذا تحول إلى جنون في جميع أنحاء أوروبا عند نقرة زر. اسمحوا لنا أن نستقبل من ولاية كولورادو الأمريكية ديفيد بارسميان، مدير ومؤسس Alternative Radio، ليشرح لنا من هم الضحايا الذين يستحقون الشفقة وأولئك الذين يجب طمس معاناتهم كالكشميريين والفلسطينيين واليمنيين والأفغان. وكصحفي مخضرم برأيه، هل ما زال هنالك في الغرب ما يسمى الصحافة الحرة؟ وما مصيرها إذا ما تجرأت على نشر تقارير عن أي من هذا؟ أم أن المعايير المزدوجة والنفاق بلغت حداً ترتعد له الفرائص وتقشعر منه الأبدان؟ أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل، معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. David Baarsmyan, award-winning Armenian-American radio broadcaster, writer, and the founder and director of Alternative Radio. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, David.
It's wonderful to be with you on Min al-Dakhil once again.
Pure pleasure to have you always, David. Now, my first question for you, does the media manufacture public consent? Let's highlight whether state-owned and corporate commercial media outlets actually equally produce public consent, and if independent media outlets are as free from political and economic constraint as they claim to be.
It's a very interesting question that you raise about media influence on culture and society, and whether they are free from so-called restraints or other outside influences. You know, there's basically two types of media, particularly in the West. You have the corporate-driven, corporate-owned media, and then you have what are called alternative media. So what I do, for example, falls in that particular category. Recently, I was rereading a very important chapter in a book called Manufacturing Consent. It's chapter 2. and it's called Worthy and Unworthy Victims. And I think you can see that, how that plays out in what's going on in the Ukraine war right now. Ukrainians within this perspective, from the US particularly, are worthy victims. We should shed tears for them, which I don't oppose. There are worthy victims and unworthy victims. So if you're an ally of the United States, then you are a worthy victim. For example, Ukrainians, Israelis, and Uyghurs in Xinjiang, China. We shed tears for them. But if it comes to Kashmiris or Palestinians or Yemenis, they are unworthy victims. We don't pay attention to them. We do not cry over their suffering. So you have this other phrase that's very popular now, particularly with the US Secretary of State, whose name is Antony Blinken. He keeps talking about the rules-based international order. This has become a very popular term to defend what the US is doing around the world. It's a cover for imperialism. It's a code for US hegemony. So independent media has got to cut through these propagandistic frameworks in order to present what's really going on to listeners and viewers all over the world.
So worthy victims are an effective tool to demonize the aggressor. They are used to obliterate nuance and ambiguity. We are good, they are evil. Worthy victims are used not only to express sanctimonious outrage, but to stoke self-adulation and a poisonous nationalism. This bifurcation into worthy and unworthy victims, who determines or defines this? And what is the criteria and the metrics in this regard, David?
Well, the state takes its cue. The corporate media takes its cue from state initiatives. So they have presented a particular picture of events, and of course it's very, very distorted and favors their particular perspective. So U.S. aggression, for example, is a non-starter. So when the U.S. Invades a country like Iraq in 2003 or Afghanistan in 2001, or tries to overthrow governments in Venezuela, Iran, Guatemala, Chile, and other countries, that all falls within the good, worthy victim paradigm. And so these people are being manipulated and used in the propaganda system in order to elicit support for policies which I think are indefensible. One also hears the term state sovereignty quite a bit from the Secretary of State and the Vice President and the President, Joe Biden. What about Iraqi sovereignty in 2003 when there was an unambiguous massive invasion and violation of the UN Charter? That's never brought up. It's a couple of days ago, I was listening to National Public Radio. Now, this is considered a very serious, sober, sophisticated media. You know, people speak in complete sentences. There's no yelling. There's no one being insulted. So it's a kind of a very smooth. And they had on as their guest Condoleezza Rice. And I was listening very carefully to this interview because I was wondering if the interviewer from National Public Radio would ask her about the violation of Iraqi sovereignty in 2003. Was that at all similar or akin to the violation, the Russian violation of Ukrainian sovereignty in 2022. And sadly, the question was never raised. You know, through a 10-minute interview, you would think that the broadcaster would have raised this very important point. But you see, from the U.S. perspective, this is how the media are, in a sense, an echo chamber for the official line. So the official line now, and it's quite understandable, is Putin is evil, Russia is bad, Russians are bad, Russians do not fight fairly, they commit war crimes. Okay, let's concede all of those points. Has the U.S. ever committed a war crime? Has the U.S. ever invaded another country? Has the U.S. ever occupied another country? What are the Saudis doing, a U.S. ally in Yemen, bombing people, killing tens of thousands, creating the worst humanitarian crisis on earth? The Saudis are worthy of our applause. The Yemenis are not. They are to suffer in silence. So it's cutting through all of these very simplistic. Yes.
Yes, we all know, David, that the Western media's Ukraine coverage has been highly charged, playing on Western feelings of sympathy for those quote-unquote blonde, blue-eyed, worthy victims and who are alone rendered human, and directing feelings towards a moral outrage that insists, even demands, a crusade of retribution and punishment for the perceived perpetrators. How do you, as a veteran journalist, David, read all this?
Well, you have to be very agile, and you have to be very attentive to the propaganda tropes that are manufactured and then almost seamlessly placed in the media, in the microphones, in the cameras, in the brains of the reporters. So the example I just gave of National Public Radio interviewing Condoleezza Rice, I think exemplifies exactly that point, that the questions do not even arise about worthy and unworthy victims. You know, there's a very clear black and white demarcation. And this goes way back to the founding of the United States, which was based on genocide and the extermination of the indigenous population. And it has continued through the centuries, actually, of propaganda about the savages who must be civilized, and we are the agents of civilization. So this is something that comes up also. I was just looking at a quote from Heinrich Himmler, the notorious SS commander in Nazi Germany, talking about how the Jews must be exterminated. Of course, all of these things are deplorable. The murder, the killing of innocent people anywhere. What about the Lebanese who have suffered time and time again from Israeli invasions, occupations, flyovers, violations of airspace, violations of sea space,
of sovereignty, time and again? Of course.
Yes, indeed. And so that's how the media makes choices. And those choices, particularly in the corporate media, are based on the hegemonic thinking that is absorbed, assimilated, and then reproduced as so-called objective reporting.
Right.
No journalist is objective. We are all products of a certain culture and a background, but we can agree on certain facts. Has Israel invaded Lebanon and occupied Lebanon? That's not a question for discussion.
And still occupies a part of Lebanon and breaches its sovereignty, violates its sovereignty over and over again on daily basis. Allow us, David, to stop now for a short break, and afterwards we will continue into this discussion of the worthy and unworthy victims after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. David بارسميان, founder and director of Alternative Radio. Welcome back, sir. Well, David, during the U.S. aggressions against Vietnam, against Iraq, Afghanistan, soldiers and Marines who attempt to report the war crimes that they witness can face a fate worse than being pressured, discredited, or ignored. Today in the Czech Republic, any person who publicly supports Russian actions in Ukraine might be subject to up to 3 years in jail. Now, where is the democracy that the West has long preached and condescended on the other world with their so-called moral superiority? Where is free speech? Where is freedom of expression and opinion?
Well, all of these things are used very selectively. Censorship, for example. We have something right in front of us with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, who gave very important and damaging information about U.S. war crimes in Iraq. And instead of being celebrated, instead of being honored and venerated, he has been jailed. He was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for 5 or 6 years. He's been in a British jail for 2 years right now, and he faces extradition to the United States, where he may be imprisoned for violating the Alien and Sedition Act. So you see how very selectively things are used. Saudi Arabia literally gets away with murder. You know, its agents kill a journalist in the Consulate General of Istanbul.
In Turkey, yes, Istanbul.
Yes. Again, where is the justice in that? Where is Saudi Arabia being held to account, where clearly it was involved in the murder, the assassination of a journalist who, by the way, was not very radical, but he did report critical information about the Saudi regime. And I'm interested now, I just use this word regime. In the discourse of propaganda here in the United States, we have governments and the unworthy people have regimes. So you hear about the Syrian regime, the Iraqi regime, the North Korean regime, but then you have the government of the United Kingdom, the government of France, the government of Italy, etc. Just another example of how language is manipulated. So the U.S. is always on the defensive. One of the big, lexical transformations occurred right after World War II ended, when the U.S. War Department was renamed as the Department of Defense. And that was a key kind of a lexical triumph for the propagandists. It now allowed them to, everything that the U.S. did was defensive. It was not offensive. So when it invaded Laos,
or when saying, David, preemptive wars.
Precisely. And then you have one of the advantages of being aligned with the master in Washington is you have a permanent pass for any crime you may commit. So again, let's stay with your part of the world. The Syrian Golan Heights has now been occupied, resettled. It's a classic example of settler colonialism. The population has been moved out, and Israeli Jews have taken over the land, and Israel has formally annexed the Syrian Golan Heights, which the U.S. under the Trump administration approved, and the Biden administration shows no signs of reneging on that particular deal. So there's another example of how the master and the master's servants are exempt from UN resolutions, from international law, etc. That's the advantage of being part of a colonized group of countries that support whatever Washington does. Now, this is not to excuse or to celebrate in any way what Putin is doing in Ukraine. What we are asking and we are insisting on as independent journalists is that the standards be applied across the board. You cannot have double standards. You cannot have one set of rules for the master and the master's servants and another set of rules for people that you don't like. There has to be consistency. And without that consistency, you have hypocrisy. And that's what we have.
David, suddenly Europe re-erected an iron curtain, but this time against Russia and by extension against China, via a kind of psyops media narrative. And at the flick of a switch, Russian discourse and perspectives are cancelled across the Western information space. Singularity and unity of messaging is Brussels' goal. Here, it is the context that matters in this monopoly over truth. How this all was switched on against a major power in just a day. Western allies are pondering, well, it could just as easily happen to them. And they realized that this might also take place with them. Don't you think so? Why did Europe say yes?
Europe said yes because it's under the thumb of Washington. It is an ally, it is a colonized space that obeys what Washington dictates. Now, one of the things that's left out in the discussion about the war in the Ukraine, in the moments we have left, I just want to inject this. There's no context or history. Does Putin, does Russia have grievances with the so-called West, with Europe and the United States? It does indeed. And it goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union when James Baker, who was then the Secretary of State, under the George H.W. Bush administration, made certain arrangements with Mikhail Gorbachev, the head of then the Soviet Union. And he told Gorbachev that NATO would not move, I'm quoting here, not 1 inch to the east. It would not move its borders where they are. Now, in return for that pledge from the United States, what did Gorbachev do? He dissolved the Warsaw Pact. At the same time, the U.S. not only did not dissolve the Warsaw Pact, NATO, it expanded NATO. It brought in a bunch of new neighbors like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all on the Russian borders. And this is the crux, or certainly one of the main issues that Putin has raised time and time again. So again, the media has to give context. It has to give history. This is not to explain or excuse war crimes or atrocities. It's fighting for an understanding of why do things happen? Why is Russia in this situation right now?
Very well said. David Baarsemian, award-winning radio broadcaster, writer, and the founder and director of Alternative Radio. Many thanks for your spirited acumen. Always a pleasure to have you, David.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you.
Always a pleasure. You take care, please. ودائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر ولمقاطع لم تعرض من هذا اللقاء تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا. وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.